The chaos of air travel has its own rhythm, rolling carry-ons, gate announcements, tired families and tired staff. But on a humid Tuesday morning at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, something happened at Gate C-14 that shattered that rhythm and sent shockwaves through the entire aviation industry. It began not with violence, not with a terrorist threat, not even with a delayed flight, but with a sneer. First class in that sweatshirt. Sure you are, sweetheart. Those were the exact words spoken by Karen Whitmore, a 52-year-old gate agent with over 2 decades of experience. Her tone was sharp, dismissive, and loud enough for a handful of nearby passengers to hear. The words were directed at Danielle Lawson, a 34-year-old black woman wearing gray joggers, a faded Howard University hoodie, and well-worn sneakers. To Karen, she didn't look the part. To Karen, she was clearly in the wrong line. But what Karen didn't know, what she could never have imagined, was that Danielle wasn't just another traveler with a boarding pass. She was the chief compliance investigator for the Federal Office of Transportation Security, returning home after leading a 10-day undercover audit codenamed Project Clear Skies. Danielle's boarding pass was valid. Her passport, though not required for a domestic flight, was her chosen form of ID, clean, well-kept, and federally issued. But Karen didn't even bother with the scanner. Instead, she stared down the woman in sweats and began flipping through the passport with theatrical disdain. "This doesn't look like you," she muttered, then laughed coldly. "You look younger here, happier." Dr. Danielle Lawson, philosophy, art history. Maybe the sarcasm was razor sharp, and the insult wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. But Danielle, trained for situations far more hostile than this, kept her composure. Her voice was even professional. "My doctorate is in aeronautical engineering. If there's a problem, scan the document or call your supervisor." Karen, however, wasn't interested in protocol. Her fingers curled around the passport, and with a single sudden motion, she ripped it in half. The sound was small, just paper tearing, but in the charged silence of the gate area, it echoed like an explosion. The color drained from passengers' faces. Phones came out. Children fell silent. And Karen, standing behind the counter with a twisted grin, believed she had exposed a fraud. What she had really done was light a match inside a powder keg. Danielle didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. Instead, she stared at the torn halves of her passport and calmly said, "You've just destroyed a federal document. Title 18, Section 1543 of the United States Code. That is a federal offense punishable by up to 25 years in prison." Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the crowd like glass. And with that, she pulled out her phone, not to record, but to call someone very specific. "Director Evans, this is Lawson. I'm invoking a code black at Gate C-14. We have an active breach of federal protocol and willful destruction of government property by an Ascendair employee. Requesting immediate TSA and FBI presence. Also notify the legal office. We may be dealing with an operational license violation." Karen froze. Her mouth hung open as if trying to form a rebuttal that would never come. The crowd shifted, whispered, filmed. The man behind her in line took a step back. Karen's smugness evaporated. In the span of a few breaths, she had gone from minor authority to federal defendant. And yet this was only the beginning. Within minutes, 2 FBI liaison agents arrived. 2 uniformed officers followed. Then came the Ascendair station supervisor, Frank Ellison, red-faced and confused. But Danielle wasn't finished. She outlined the violation in precise legal terms, laid out every missed step, and established a perimeter around the gate like she had done in dozens of investigations before. The gate was shut down. The flight was canceled. The boarding counter was officially deemed a federal investigation scene. What Karen thought was an ordinary dire routine shift, filled with eye rolls, passive aggression, and unchecked assumptions, had become the epicenter of a national scandal. And what she had torn wasn't just a passport. It was the veil hiding decades of systemic bias, misconduct, and failure to follow the very rules the industry was sworn to uphold. This was not the end of the story, but it was the spark that would ignite a firestorm. Danielle Lawson had not intended to make headlines that day. She hadn't dressed to be seen. She wasn't looking for recognition. But in the moments following the destruction of her passport, ripped in half by a gate agent acting on nothing more than bias and misplaced pride, The seasoned federal investigator knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't even just about a ruined document. This was about rot, and for the first time in her career, Danielle was standing directly on top of it. By the time the FBI and TSA had taken control of Gate C-14, Danielle had already shifted into full operational mode. Her years in the field had trained her to move swiftly but methodically, turning moments of chaos into structured investigations. This wasn't just another incident report. This was now the central node of a live federal case. Karen Whitmore, the gate agent, who had torn the passports, stood frozen behind the counter, her eyes darting between Danielle, the federal agents, and the growing crowd. Her smugness had drained from her face like blood from an open wound. She didn't understand how everything had turned against her so quickly. She had thought she was just doing her job. But that's the most dangerous lie of all, the idea that cruelty, when performed in uniform, is somehow just protocol. As two federal agents gently took Karen aside, Danielle made her way to a private holding room where she was joined by Agent Thomas Davies of the FBI's Airport Liaison Division and Agent Lila Chen from the Department of Transportation's Legal Enforcement Unit. Both were familiar with Danielle. They had worked with her on past audits and knew exactly what it meant when she declared a code black. This wasn't about a single employee anymore. It was about a culture, and Danielle had just caught it in the act. She laid it out with clinical clarity: the agent's destruction of her passport, the refusal to follow verification protocols, the language used, dressed like that people like you, and the immediate failure by a supervisor to intervene. It was a textbook case of racial profiling, followed by obstruction of federal procedure. "Start with the gate cameras," she told the agents. "We'll need the last 48 hours of footage. Also pull employee logs and security scan reports. I want to know how many times she's deviated from ID protocol. And I want her personnel file full complaints, history, disciplinary records, everything." Within the hour, Danielle's temporary command center had been established in a quiet corporate conference room a few gates down. Ascend Air executives, alerted to the incident, began calling frantically from their regional headquarters, demanding explanations and updates. But it was already too late. The situation had escalated beyond corporate spin. This was now federal. What began to emerge over the next few hours wasn't just troubling, it was staggering. Karen Whitmore's personnel file contained 14 formal complaints over the last 5 years, 9 from passengers of color, 3 from travelers with disabilities, 2 from foreign tourists who struggled with English and were publicly shamed for it. Each complaint had been filed, reviewed, and dismissed. The common factor: Frank Ellison, the station supervisor, had signed off on all of them with notes like "counseled employee matter resolved" or "no further action required." It was a damning pattern, one that pointed to a culture of silence, not oversight. Danielle reviewed the complaints with growing anger. She wasn't just seeing the story of one bad actor. She was watching a system protect itself. She read about an elderly black woman who had been told to step aside while others boarded first despite her holding a first-class ticket. A Muslim man who had been randomly selected for screening 3 separate times be Karen. A paraplegic veteran who was told he was holding up the line and should have requested a wheelchair. Each report had been buried, each passenger gaslit, and each time the quiet hum of injustice had been mistaken for business as usual. As Danielle and her team dug deeper, the rot widened. Surveillance footage from other gates showed patterns of discriminatory behavior across multiple employees. A baggage supervisor had an unusually high record of lost luggage, overwhelmingly affecting passengers with African or Middle Eastern surnames. A ticketing agent, it turned out, had a suspicious habit of assigning black families to middle seats even when other seats were available. These weren't accidents. They were calculated slights, the kind that hide in plain sight until someone looks closely enough. And Danielle was looking. By the second day of the investigation, the FAA had issued an emergency compliance directive. Ascend Air's entire Atlanta hub was now under federal audit. All flight logs, maintenance records, safety reports, and personnel files were to be turned over. Failure to comply would result in the suspension of their operational certificate. Frank Ellison, once the unshakable authority at this terminal, now found himself cornered in his own office, facing questions he could no longer dodge. "Mr. Ellison," Danielle began, her tone calm but edged with steel, How many of those complaints against Ms. Whitmore did you personally investigate? Frank shifted in his chair, wiping his palms on his slacks. I talked to her about them, gave verbal warnings. We're in the airline business. If we reacted to every customer with a grudge, we'd never board a flight. Danielle didn't blink. You weren't managing, you were enabling. And now you've enabled criminal behavior. Do you understand that Frank's silence was answer enough? Meanwhile, the story had already begun leaking to the press. A short video clip captured by a young woman in line during the passport incident had gone viral. It showed Karen Whitmore tearing the passport in half, Danielle calmly citing the federal statute and the immediate arrival of agents. The clip hit a nerve. Within hours, news anchors across the country were debating racial profiling in airports, while hashtags like Gate C14 and Justice for Danielle began trending nationwide. But Danielle wasn't focused on media. She was focused on accountability. Her team uncovered email chains between Karen and Frank filled with dismissive language about problem passengers and one particularly damning line. Try to keep it less obvious next time. LOL. The LOL sealed Frank's fate. It was no longer negligence. It was collusion. And still the investigation dug deeper. Maintenance logs revealed that Ascend Air's Atlanta hub had extended the service life of dozens of aircraft components past recommended safety limits. One flight months earlier had suffered a cabin pressure malfunction and was forced to land in Denver. The official report blamed the manufacturer. Danielle's team found that the mechanic who had allegedly signed off on the inspection was on vacation in Aruba at the time. The misconduct was no longer just racial, it was criminal, and it endangered lives. Danielle briefed the FAA, DOJ, and DOT in a classified call that night. She recommended full federal oversight of Ascend Air's Atlanta operations, immediate dismissal of involved personnel, and referral for criminal charges where appropriate. They agreed. By day 3, federal agents escorted Karen Whitmore from her suburban home in handcuffs. Frank Ellison was fired and charged with falsification of safety records. The airline's CEO issued a public apology that fell flat. Stock prices plummeted. Congressional hearings were scheduled. But for Danielle Lawson, the most powerful moment came not in the conference room, but in a brief moment of stillness. She stood alone in the airport at sunrise, looking out across the empty tarmac. The same place where she had been humiliated now stood as the backdrop to one of the most significant investigations of her career. She wasn't angry. She wasn't triumphant. She was resolved. The truth she knew doesn't roar. It doesn't demand attention. It waits quiet, steady, and sharp until someone is brave enough to speak it out loud. And when they do, systems fall. People listen. And justice for once is not delayed. In the weeks that followed the now infamous incident at Gate C14, the fallout spread like a slow-moving avalanche, unstoppable, deliberate, and devastating. What began with the sound of a passport being torn in half had turned into a reckoning not just for Ascend Air, but for the entire ecosystem that had allowed people like Karen Whitmore and Frank Ellison to thrive unchecked for years. Danielle Lawson was no longer just the woman in gray joggers with a calm voice and a badge tucked away in her backpack. She had become a national figure, though not by choice. And yet she never chased the spotlight. She didn't give interviews, pose for cameras, or post statements online. Her focus remained exactly where it had always been, on the system and on how to fix it. The FAA's emergency oversight operation had now taken full control of Ascend Air's Atlanta hub. The airline's operating certificate wasn't just under review, it was hanging by a thread. Investigators pored over everything: hiring practices, customer service protocols, maintenance logs, internal communications, union grievances, whistleblower reports. What they found painted a picture not just of misconduct, but of institutional decay. It wasn't just Karen. She was merely the match. There were dozens of employees across multiple departments whose records revealed the same pattern: racial bias in passenger handling, procedural shortcuts in security checks, inconsistencies in equipment reporting, and supervisors like Frank W. who routinely minimized or dismissed complaints. One particularly damning case involved a ticketing manager who altered boarding assignments to separate families with foreign surnames, claiming it helped with balance distribution. Another baggage handler had been quietly moved after accidentally misplacing wheelchairs and walkers for elderly passengers of color. These weren't isolated mistakes. They were symptoms of a deeper problema company that prioritized efficiency metrics and customer appeasement over fairness, accuracy, and basic decency. The FAA released a preliminary internal report within 14 days. It was leaked to the press within 15. And that's when the real firestorm began. News outlets across the country latched onto the headline, "Federal Agent's Passport Torn and Racially Charged Airline Encounter Triggers Nationwide Audit." The accompanying video filmed by a college student waiting in line behind Danielle had now been played on every major network and shared on millions of phones. The clip, less than 90 seconds long, became a cultural touchstone. Karen's smug defiance, Danielle's legal precision, the stunned silence of the passengers, and finally the agents arriving to shut it all down. It was a masterclass in control professionalism and what real power looked like. Public outrage exploded. Civil rights organizations released statements. Travel associations expressed concern. The NAACP called for a complete overhaul of airline customer service training. A coalition of retired pilots and flight attendants published an open letter to the Department of Transportation demanding that Ascend Air's senior leadership be held accountable for fostering what they described as a hostile and exclusionary corporate culture. And then came Congress. A bipartisan committee summoned Danielle to testify on Capitol Hill under the formal subject of discrimination and security integrity in U.S. aviation. The hearing was broadcast live. It wasn't just a procedural review, it was a moment of national self-reflection. Danielle arrived in a sharp navy suit and low heels, her natural hair pulled back in a braided bun. She carried no notes. She needed none. The committee chair, Senator Elaine Rodriguez of Illinois, introduced her with gravity. "Ms. Lawson, you were not just a victim of an individual's poor judgment. You were a witness, perhaps the first in year, to the deep systemic failure of an industry that claims to serve all Americans equally." Danielle spoke clearly without dramatics, yet with profound weight. What happened to me at Gate C-14 is not rare. What's rare is that it happened to someone trained to document it, equipped to challenge it, and supported by a system that, this time, chose not to look away. She didn't just speak about herself. She told the stories of others, the passengers whose complaints were ignored, the families who were humiliated, the veterans whose dignity was stripped away in public. And then she showed the data racial disparities in ID challenges, inconsistencies in upgrade approvals, a statistically improbable frequency of random screenings assigned to Black, Latino, and Muslim passengers. She presented all of it. She laid it bare. And the room, normally filled with interruptions and partisan posturings, sat in silent, reverent attention. At one point, Senator James Norwood of Iowa, a conservative voice not known for emotional displays, leaned into his microphone and said, "Lawson, I believe you've done more for this industry's integrity in the last 3 weeks than some of its executives have done in 30 years. And for that, I thank you." But perhaps the most poignant moment came at the very end. A large screen behind Danielle displayed the 2 torn halves of her passport. They had been preserved and photographed by FAA forensics, showing her photo, the other, the national seal of the United States, now torn straight through the eagle's wings. Danielle turned to the panel. "This wasn't just a passport. It was my proof of identity, of citizenship, of belonging. It was treated like it didn't matter, because someone decided I didn't matter, that I didn't look the part. But if we allow federal credentials, regardless of who holds them, to be discarded based on skin tone or attire, then we've lost something far more dangerous than just a document. We've lost the integrity of our gatekeepers." The room remained still for several seconds. And then came applause, not from the gallery, from the senators. That had not happened in over 2 years of hearings. While Danielle continued her work behind the scenes, the repercussions kept rolling forward. Karen Whitmore was charged with destruction of a federal document, a felony carrying up to 25 years. But the U.S. attorney also tacked on civil rights violations, citing the pattern of complaints as evidence of a discriminatory motive. Her trial was set for later that year. She pleaded not guilty, but her legal defense began to crumble the moment Frank Ellison, desperate for a deal, agreed to testify. Frank's plea deal was brutal. He forfeited his pension. He received a 5-year federal prison sentence, and his name was added to a permanent no-hire list for any FAA-regulated industry. His fall was swift and permanent, but the biggest hit came to Ascend Air itself. The FAA slapped the company with a $137 million fine, the largest in the agency's history. In addition to the penalty, The airline was forced to submit to 5 years of federal monitoring, retrain its entire staff, and establish an independent oversight board chaired by former federal investigators. One of those board members, Danielle Lawson. Their CEO, Terrence Gibbons, gave a nationally televised apology that was widely panned as robotic and rehearsed. Shares in Ascendair dropped 23% within 48 hours. Major corporate partners pulled advertising. Travel blogs encouraged boycotts. Some lawmakers even suggested revoking their federal subsidies if benchmarks weren't met within 12 months. Public trust once broken is nearly impossible to regain. The industry took note. Other airlines began proactively launching internal reviews, hoping to avoid the kind of scrutiny that had torn Ascend apart. Mandatory anti-bias training was implemented across several major carriers. New federal legislation was proposed to strengthen accountability in transportation security practice, including a Lawson provision that would make destruction of federally issued ID at a transportation checkpoint a specific standalone felony offense. It was systemic change, real change, and it began with a moment that was supposed to humiliate a woman in sweatpants. Danielle never sought praise, but she did accept something far more meaningful: a legacy. 6 months after the incident, she was named Senior Director of Aviation Integrity, Civil Compliance for the Department of Transportation. Her role was created specifically to design and enforce reforms based on what she exposed. She didn't celebrate. She got to work. Because for Danielle, the story was never about punishment. It was about precision, about making sure no one else would ever be told they don't belong in a space they've rightfully earned, and that no one else would ever have to carry the weight of professionalism while someone else wielded the weight of prejudice. What happened at Gate C-14 may have begun with one sneer, but it ended with an entire industry being forced to look in the mirror. And this time, it couldn't look away. The chaos at Gate C-14 had subsided. The cameras were gone, the courtroom dates set, and the public had largely moved on to the next national scandal. But Danielle Lawson knew the true battle was just beginning, because real change, doesn't end when the headlines fade. It begins in the quiet, often thankless labor of rebuilding what prejudice has corroded. Now operating from her newly established position as Senior Director of Aviation Integrity and Civil Compliance within the U.S. Department of Transportation, Danielle spent her days not in the field, but in policy rooms, in conference halls, in boardrooms filled with corporate attorneys, regulators, engineers, and government officials who had all seen the storm that tore through Ascendair and were suddenly very interested in weatherproofing their own operations. The Lawson provision, introduced in Congress just 6 weeks after her testimony, passed with rare bipartisan support. It made the destruction of any federally issued identification at a transportation checkpoint a standalone felony, removing ambiguity that had long allowed low-level employees to act with impunity. But the law was only the beginning. Danielle wanted systemic architecture, a permanent scaffolding of fairness, clarity, and enforcement. To do that, she needed to address the invisible mechanics of discrimination, the policies written in vague language, the loopholes buried in fine print, and the discretionary judgment clauses that empowered employees like Karen Whitmore to act on bias under the guise of protecting security. She began with training reform. In partnership with the FAA and multiple airline safety boards, Danielle created the CLEAR framework and acronym for consistency and protocol, legal compliance at every checkpoint, empathetic engagement with passengers, accountability for misconduct, and recognition of bias, implicit and explicit. It wasn't just a slideshow and a test at the end. It was an immersive, federally accredited certification program designed for every airline employee who handled passenger identification or security clearance, from check-in clerks to TSA agents. It featured real scenarios, role reversal exercises, psychological de-escalation training, and for the first time, a federal requirement that failure to complete the program meant disqualification from gate-level roles. The resistance came quickly. Several major carriers pushed back. They claimed it was too costly, too disruptive, and insulting to experienced staff. But Danielle had leveraged the audit data from Ascendair. The FAA had granted her authority to show other companies the redacted reports, evidence of real financial and reputational destruction for noncompliance. And it worked. Within 4 months, 4 major airlines signed memorandums of agreement to begin rolling out the CLEAR framework. Regional carriers followed. Smaller private airports joined in. By the end of the fiscal year, over 72% of domestic airline staff had registered for certification, and more than 40,000 had completed the full course. But Danielle didn't stop there. She created the Passenger Fairness Index, a real-time reporting system that tracked incidents of identification rejections delays due to profiling, random screenings, and complaint resolutions. Each airline had a score. Each airport hub had a dashboard. It was publicly available, searchable, and updated weekly. For the first time in aviation history, passengers could see how their home airport ranked in terms of fairness and compliance, just like safety scores or on-time departure ratings. And the effect was immediate. Airports with high scores leaned into the visibility, launching We Fly Fair campaigns and proudly displaying their badges. Those with low scores faced heat from local media, congressional representatives, and passenger advocacy groups. Several HR departments at major hubs quietly began reviewing employee records to avoid another Gate C-14 situation. One airline that hadn't been part of the original scandal but had a lot to lose was Sky North Airways, a once regional carrier that had recently expanded into major U.S. markets. Its CEO, Marjorie Blake, a former marketing executive with no background in security or compliance, had dismissed the Ascend incident as a one-off in an early interview, calling it a moment of bad customer service blown out of proportion. Danielle had seen the clip, and she remembered it. So when Sky North's Newark terminal began registering a spike in first-class ID challenges, and when multiple complaints emerged from passengers claiming they were separated from family seating due to security concerns, Danielle ordered a quiet audit. Not a high-profile media storm, just a team of 4 agents, 2 weeks of footage, and back-end access to the Passenger Fairness Index. What they found was chilling. A group of 5 employees had created a secret tagging system using highlighted check marks on printed boarding passes to signal passengers who looked off based on nothing more than race attire or language fluency. They weren't just targeting passengers, they were tracking them. 3 of them had previously worked at Ascend Air's Atlanta hub. Danielle moved swiftly. The audit results were sent directly to the Sky North Board of Directors, and within 72 hours, all 5 employees were terminated. The Newark terminal supervisor resigned. CEO Marjorie Blake issued a public apology and invited Danielle to lead an internal town hall for 6,000 Sky North employees nationwide. Danielle accepted. And in that town hall, she told a story not just of Gate C-14, but of the mechanics of arrogance, the quiet calculations of prejudice, and the power of transparency. The moment became a turning point, not just for Sky North, but for the broader industry. Meanwhile, Danielle's efforts began attracting attention outside aviation. Amtrak approached her team to explore applying the CLEAR framework to train conductors and boarding staff on their long-distance routes. Cruise lines, notoriously unregulated when it came to guest profiling, and boarding practices, sought consulting support. Even tech companies, especially those in facial recognition and digital ID, began inviting Danielle to ethics panels to help design inclusive, bias-resistant systems. Her story had stopped being just an aviation tale. It had become a blueprint for institutional reform. But the emotional cost of the work remained steep. One evening, months after the congressional hearing, Danielle sat alone in her office reviewing a new batch of whistleblower reports. She came across a letter from a retired black airline captain who had flown commercial jets for over 30 years. He had never spoken publicly, never filed complaints, but after watching her testimony, he felt compelled to write. I flew planes for this country, but I was still asked to show ID at my own hangar door. My white co-pilots never were. I let it go every time. I told myself it wasn't worth it, that my job was too important to risk. You, Ms. Lawson, reminded me that justice is not the enemy of professionalism. It is its foundation. Danielle wiped her eyes. She didn't cry often, but that night she did. Not out of grief, but out of relief. Someone had finally said what she had always believed, that dignity and competence are not mutually exclusive, and that the burden of restraint should never outweigh the right to fairness. The story of Danielle Lawson had now entered American consciousness not as a footnote, but as a case study. Universities used it in ethics and business courses. Diversity consultants referenced it. Even the FAA's annual leadership summit titled their closing session that year, Gate C-14, When Silence Breaks and Systems Shift. And yet Danielle remained grounded. She didn't want statues, or awards, or TED Talks. She wanted systems. She wanted paper trails that led to policy, metrics that led to accountability, and culture shifts that outlived her name. Because that's what reform really is, not just attention, but architecture. The ability to build something stronger in the place where something rotten once stood. And so she kept showing up. To meetings, to flight audits, to staff trainings in cold conference rooms with bad coffee, to terminals where whispers of change were starting to replace the rustle of resentment. She walked through airports differently now, not as a passenger hoping for peace, but as a steward of a movement, quietly checking that the world she fought for was still being built. One gate, one scan, one interaction at a time. Because long after the cameras leave and the crowd forgets, the system still remembers. And Danielle Lawson is making sure it never forgets what fairness is supposed to feel like. By the start of the following year, Danielle Lawson had become a living paradox. To the public, she was a symbol calm, composed, and unwavering. To the institutions she challenged, she was both a cautionary tale and a force of reform. And to herself, she was simply tired. The whirlwind that began at Gate C-14 had now matured into a nationwide framework for accountability. The CLEAR framework was being integrated into 89% of U.S. commercial airlines. The Passenger Fairness Index had gone global, with airports in Canada, the UK, and Germany requesting access. Federal legislation had passed naming her as the author of the landmark Lawson Aviation Fairness Mandate, which expanded civil rights protections for all federally regulated transportation environments. Yet behind the accolades and results, Danielle lived with a quiet, gnawing reality. Change was heavy and sometimes lonely. Her days now unfolded in 5-minute intervals. From federal compliance calls to crisis mitigation briefings, from speaking with whistleblowers to reviewing airport performance metrics, she lived at the nexus of pressure and policy. She had become the very thing she once studied: system. And in doing so, she found herself asking the question she never expected: was there still a place for the human being behind the badge? That question surfaced most clearly during a visit to Denver International Airport, one of the first in the country to implement the full CLEAR program. Danielle had arrived unannounced, preferring to observe from the periphery. She wore her usual travel attire, neutral clothes, no name tag, nothing to indicate her role. She wanted to blend in, but even there change had a scent, a quiet shift. From the moment she approached the gate, the energy was different. The gate agent, a young man named Marcos, greeted her with a warm, rehearsed professionalism. "Good afternoon, Mom. Boarding pass and ID, please." She handed over her credentials. He took a moment to scan them, then looked up. His eyes paused, not in suspicion, but in recognition. Then something rare happened. He smiled. Not the performative smile of customer service, but a genuine one. "I just want to say thanks," he said quietly. "We all had to take that course, the CLEAR one. I didn't get it at first. I thought it was just more training. But then I saw your video, the one at the hearing, and now I get it. So thank you for everything." Danielle gave a small nod. "Thank you for doing the work," she replied. As she walked down the jet bridge, something unexpected stirred inside her: hope. Not the abstract kind, but the grounded kind. Hope as evidence, as proof, that even when she wasn't looking, the seeds were growing. Still, there were challenges waiting in the wings. One of the most complex cases she faced came not from airline, but from the private charter sector. These flights, often catering to wealthy clients and government contractors, had long operated in a gray space, technically under FAA oversight, but free from many of the passenger protection requirements. Danielle's team had received a string of complaints from Black executives, journalists, and even a former U.S. ambassador who had been denied boarding, harassed, or forced into additional verification when attempting to fly via high-end charter services. The common thread: no clear documentation, no body cams, no union protections. Just he said, she said, and a very expensive ticket. She knew what this meant. She'd have to go undercover again. Her staff warned against it. It wasn't safe. Her name was too well known. But Danielle knew the truth. Some systems only show their cracks when no one knows they're being watched. She arranged to board a private charter out of San Diego, posing as a tech consultant heading to D.C. for a last-minute meeting. She dressed modestly, traveled light, and paid full fare from a decoy account. When she arrived at the terminal, the receptionist barely looked at her. But the moment her ID was scanned, the attitude changed. The attendant leaned in, whispered to a colleague. A man in a suit emerged from the back. He approached Danielle with a condescending smile and said, "We're going to need to verify this ID a second time." Protocol. When she asked why he offered nothing but its policy, he then asked if she had another form of ID, perhaps utility bills or business credentials. Danielle remained still, her voice low but firm. "I'll wait here while you call your legal counsel." The man paused. "Excuse me." She reached into her bag, pulled out a small black folder. Inside her federal badge. His expression dropped. "I suggest you get your supervisor. This facility is about to be part of an active investigation." Within 2 hours, the FAA had agents on site. Within 3, Danielle had a sworn affidavit from another passenger, a Latina entrepreneur, who had experienced the same treatment 2 months prior but hadn't spoken out. The story went viral. The private jet, world-long considered immune from scrutiny, was suddenly front and center in a national conversation about elitism, race, and unchecked gatekeeping in luxury travel. The Department of Transportation quickly extended Danielle's authority to include oversight of charter services. Within 90 days, over 140 private carriers had voluntarily opted into the Passenger Fairness Index, many realizing the PR risk of resisting transparency. But Danielle knew reform wasn't just about new rules. It was about rebuilding trust. And so she began traveling again, not to police, but to teach. She spoke at airline leadership summits, small rural airports, community town halls, and even training centers in Oklahoma and Alaska. She refused to stay in D.C., detached from the reality on the ground. One night, while speaking to a group of newly hired TSA trainees, a young woman raised her hand. "What do you do," she asked, "when your coworkers laugh off the training, when they still say things like, 'You can just tell who's suspicious'?" Danielle's answer was simple. "You remember that laughter," she said. "You write it down. You tell someone you trust. And if they still don't listen, you find me." A quiet hum passed through the room, because everyone in that room now knew they weren't alone. Months later, Danielle received an invitation she never expected. It came from Eleanor Thompson, the newly appointed CEO of Ascendair, Ascend, the very company where this all began. The letter was formal but earnest. Thompson had taken over after the board ousted the previous leadership. She was a former flight attendant, a woman of color, and she had a vision. "We'd like you to return to Gate C-14, to see what it has become. We've renamed it. We've redesigned it. We've made it a training hub. And we'd like you to speak to our new class of hires, the first to go through our rebuilt equity program. Not for the press, just for them, and for you." Danielle hesitated, but eventually she agreed. When she arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson, the energy felt different. Gate C-14 now bore a new name, the Lawson Learning Gate. Above it, a plaque in recognition of a moment that sparked reform. "May every boarding be a step toward justice." Inside, 18 trainees waited, uniforms pressed, notebooks out, no media, no reporters, just learners, just hearts and minds ready to work. Danielle stood before them. She didn't begin with stats or scandal. She began with a whisper. "I was standing right where you are now when someone told me I didn't belong here." And for the next hour, she told the story not to shame, but to empower. She talked about fear, about holding in her rage, about wanting to yell, but choosing instead to act. She reminded them that their jobs weren't about scanning IDs or managing crowds. Their jobs were to be the first ambassadors of fairness in a space where so many feel invisible. When she finished, no one applauded, not because they weren't moved, but because they were processing. One trainee, a former military nurse, stood up and asked, "Do you think things will really stay better, or will it just slide back?" Danielle didn't lie. "Only if people like you stay awake," she said. "That's how systems stay honest." As she walked away from the gate, this time without a badge or a camera following her, Danielle Lawson allowed herself one long, deep breath. The kind you take not at the end of a journey, but when you're strong enough to know you're right in the middle of it, and maybe always will be. Because justice isn't a final destination. It's a gate that must always remain open, watched, guarded, and walked through by those bold enough to say, "I belong here." And so does everyone else. It had been nearly 16 months since Danielle Lawson stood silently in front of Gate C-14 and watched a gate agent rip her passport in half. 16 months since she had calmly invoked federal law. Since she turned humiliation into accountability. Since she became, against her own will, a symbol. She never planned to lead a movement, She never asked to testify before Congress, design a federal training framework, or be cited in law textbooks and ethics seminars. But she had done it all. Not because she wanted the credit, but because no one else had stood up when it mattered most. And now with the clear framework solidified across aviation, the Passenger Fairness Index adopted internationally, and private carriers voluntarily opting into reform, Danielle found herself at a crossroads. Not of policy, but of purpose. Her calendar was filled with speaking requests from Ivy League law schools, human rights forums, to United Nations panels. Publishing houses had sent seven-figure offers for her memoir. A prestigious documentary team had asked to shadow her for 6 months, promising to capture the soul behind the story. Cable networks wanted exclusive interviews. One even offered her a primetime slot to host a series on justice and reform. Everyone wanted Danielle Lawson, the icon, but no one seemed to be asking what Danielle Lawson, the person, actually wanted. That question haunted her on long flights between cities and quiet hotel rooms, in the moments after keynotes when the applause faded and the lights dimmed. Because the truth was, she didn't feel like a public figure. She felt like a witness. And witnesses, in her view, belonged in the field, not in front of the camera. One evening, as she returned home to her modest apartment in D.C., she found an envelope tucked under her door. There was no return address, just a handwritten note inside. "Thank you for changing everything, but please don't forget the ones still waiting for someone to notice. We don't all get cameras. We don't all get justice. But some of us are still hanging on because you did what you did. Don't disappear." There was no signature, just the truth. And that truth stayed with her. Weeks later, Danielle met privately with Secretary Allison Roth of the U.S. Department of Transportation. It was meant to be a standard policy briefing, but halfway through, Roth leaned forward with a different kind of proposition. "We want to nominate you for Deputy Secretary of Compliance and Civil Protection. You'd have full oversight, not just aviation, but rail, freight, highway, and maritime. It's a presidential appointment, full Senate confirmation. Are you ready for that kind of spotlight?" Danielle didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked for time. Not days, weeks. Because this wasn't just a career decision. It was an identity decision. Would she continue operating from behind the curtain, quietly forcing institutions to improve from within? Or would she step fully into the arena, name on the letterhead, face in the papers, responsible for defending the very progress she had architected? The question felt suffocating, not because she feared power, but because she understood its cost. To help find clarity, Danielle did something she hadn't done in over a year. She took a trip that had nothing to do with work. No keynotes, no compliance audits, no formal dinners. Just a ticket to Selma, Alabama, and a quiet car rental that took her to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. She had studied the bridge in college, taught about it in guest lectures, cited it in federal hearings, but she had never stood on it. And now, as she walked the length of it alone at Sunrashano, security detail, no media, no crowd, she felt something ancient settle in her chest. A weight, but not a burden. A calling. She thought about John Lewis, about Amelia Boynton, about the nameless marchers who bled for dignity. People who didn't have legislation or hashtags to protect them. People who walked anyway. She placed one hand on the cold iron railing. The air was silent, reverent, and in that silence, she made her decision. She would not run from visibility, but she would not chase it either. She would accept the nomination, but on her terms. Upon returning to D.C., she called Secretary Roth. "I'll accept," she said, "but I want full authority to establish a community oversight division under my office. It will be staffed by former passengers, whistleblowers, advocates. Not just lawyers and administrators, real people. I want a seat at the table for them permanently." Roth hesitated. "That's unconventional." Danielle smiled. So was ripping up a federal passport at a boarding gate. There was a long pause. "Then it's yours." The confirmation hearings were brutal. Certain senators labeled her too radical, accusing her of injecting identity politics into transportation. One demanded to know if she supported banning entire employees over one complaint. Another questioned her ability to lead with objectivity, given her past experience as a victim. Danielle never flinched. She countered every attack with fact, every insinuation with composure. When one senator sneered, "What makes you think a woman who was mistreated in an airport can lead a multi-agency federal division?" Danielle replied without blinking. "Because a woman who was mistreated in an airport refused to become bitter, filed proper reports, followed federal procedure, and turned a single act of humiliation into a national audit that improved safety, compliance, and dignity for over 310 million passengers. That's why the hearing room fell silent. Her confirmation passed 6436. As Deputy Secretary of Compliance and Civil Protection, Danielle began working out of a new federal office floor-to-ceiling windows, 5 full-time staff, and a team of over 200 spread across the country. But she kept one thing the same: a framed photo on her desk, the two halves of her torn passport now mounted side by side. Beneath it, a brass plate that read, "Never forget what started it. Never forget who it was supposed to silence." Her first official act was to launch the People's Gate Initiative, a program that designated 5 high-volume airport gates per year to be repurposed as transparency zone, publicly funded areas where passengers could learn their rights, report misconduct, and directly interact with trained advocates. It wasn't just a PR move, it was policy with teeth. Each gate included cameras, a multilingual reporting center, digital dashboards with real-time data, and on-site compliance liaisons, not hired by the airline, but by the Department of Transportation. And the name the first gate naturally was Gate C14 in Atlanta. But Danielle changed the signage. It no longer said the Lawson Gate. Instead it read, "The People's Gate where fairness boards first." Because this was never about her. It was about the woman who didn't speak English well and was told to step aside, the man in a wheelchair who was asked to wait until last, the teenage girl in a hijab who was selected randomly 4 times in a row, and the countless others who didn't go viral, who didn't get justice, who are still waiting. Danielle's story began with a gate. Now she had opened gates for everyone else. Late one night, long after most of her staff had gone home, Danielle walked the empty corridor of her office building. A janitor nodded at her as he mopped the floor. "Working late again, Ms. Lawson." She smiled softly. "Seems like justice always works the night shift." And as she turned the corner, her phone buzzed. A message from a young flight attendant in Phoenix: "A woman today thanked me for treating her with respect. She said it was the first time she had been questioned in years. I told her we're trained differently now, that it's because of you. Thank you." Danielle stared at the screen. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she let the moment land. Let it sink into the bones. Because that was the win. Not the job title, not the hearing, not the national attention, but the quiet change, the shift, the reversal of an old pattern, one gate, one moment at a time. She powered down her phone, turned off the lights, and left the building. Outside, the city buzzed as it always did. But somewhere in some airport, a stranger was boarding a plane and for once was not made to feel like they didn't belong. And that was enough. A year into her tenure as Deputy Secretary of Compliance and Civil Protection, Danielle Lawson sat alone in the back row of a small community town hall in Raleigh, North Carolina. No cameras, no security escort, no podium, just her and a notebook. The room was filled with airport employees, gate agents, baggage handlers, TSA officers. They had gathered to discuss the rollout of the People's Gate Initiative at Raleigh-Durham International, and Danielle had quietly slipped in without fanfare. She wanted to listen, not lead. At the front of the room, a young black woman named Jasmine, a newly hired gate agent, stood nervously holding a microphone. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke. "I applied for this job last year because I needed stability. I stayed because of the training, because for the first time I felt like someone designed this job with people like me in mind. Not just to serve, but to be protected too. And if Ms. Lawson is ever out there listening, I just want to say thank you." Danielle didn't stand, didn't reveal herself. She just smiled softly, closed her notebook, and let Jasmine have her moment. Because that was the goal all along, to make sure people didn't have to know her name to feel her work. Over the months that followed, Danielle began to plan her exit. Not in protest, not out of fatigue, but from clarity. She had created the frameworks. She had built the teams, passed the legislation, and embedded reform into the DNA of an entire industry. And she knew good leaders don't stay forever. They build what lasts when they leave. Her decision wasn't announced publicly. She gave Secretary Roth 6 months' notice and quietly began mentoring her successor, a brilliant Korean-American attorney named Grace Cho, who had come up through the department's Civil Rights Division and shared Danielle's relentless belief in procedural justice. As the handoff approached, people began asking Danielle if she'd consider elected office, run for Senate, serve as a federal judge, write a book. She said no to all of it. Instead, she said yes to something no one expected: silence. Her final act in office was to attend the opening of the 100th People's Gate, this time at Los Angeles International Airport. The terminal was modern, sunlit, and lined with digital displays showing passenger rights complaint resolution data and traveler testimonials. A crowd of employees and local leaders had gathered. Grace Cho gave the keynote address. And then at the very end, the MC turned toward the reserved seat in the front row. "Ms. Lawson," he said, "would you like to say a few words?" She stood, walked to the microphone, and looked at the crowd not as a figurehead, but as a witness, one last time. "There's a question I've been asked hundreds of times since that day at Gate C-14. What did it feel like when she tore your passport in half? I've thought a lot about that. And the truth is, it felt like watching a piece of myself be declared invalid, unworthy, disposable. But now that torn passport hangs in a federal museum. And around the country, strangers walk through gates built on the ruins of that arrogance. And they walk freely, quietly, confidently. That's what justice feels like. Not noise, but the absence of fear." The room rose in standing ovation. Danielle gave one small nod, stepped away from the mic, and never spoke on a public stage again. In the years that followed, Danielle Lawson's legacy only deepened, not because she chased it, but because she trusted it. The clear framework became standard not only in aviation, but in interstate rail, maritime cruise terminals, and transport hubs in over a dozen countries. The Passenger Fairness Index was translated into 14 languages, and Danielle's story was taught in over 120 universities, from civil rights law to public policy to organizational ethics. But Danielle herself, she returned to something simpler: a quiet home, a garden, a community library, and a part-time advisory role at a nonprofit focused on protecting whistleblowers in public service. Every now and then, she would get a letter from a passenger, from a former gate agent, from a student, from a stranger. Some just said, "You helped me breathe again." Others said, "You made me stay in the fight." But her favorite, it came from a little girl named Nia, age 9, flying for the first time with her parents. It said, "Dear Ms. Lawson, I was scared to fly." But at the gate, the lady said, "You're safe here. This gate was made for you." And I believed her. So I got on the plane, and I didn't cry. Thank you for making gates that don't hurt people. Danielle kept that letter in her desk drawer, because when the world forgets the headlines, when the applause fades, when the names change and the plaques tarnish, that's what matters. A gate that doesn't hurt, a child who boards without fear, and a woman who once stood unshaken in sweatpants and changed the world not with outrage but with order. Not with a roar, but with resolve. Not to be remembered, but to be replaced by justice. The story of Danielle Lawson offers powerful life lessons that resonate deeply, especially with older audiences who have witnessed decades of social change. It reminds us that injustice often hides in everyday places, in assumptions, in uniforms, in unchecked authority. But it also teaches that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet, it's measured, it's the voice that stays calm when it has every right to shout. Danielle's story shows that change begins not with anger, but with clarity when someone chooses professionalism over pride, truth over ego, and justice over convenience. In life, we may never stand before Congress or lead federal reform, but we can refuse to let unfairness go unnoticed. We can speak up with grace, we can demand accountability with dignity, and most importantly, we can remember that real leadership isn't about being in charge, it's about doing what's right when no one expects it. The next time we're treated unfairly or see someone else silenced, let us not retreat. Let us remember Danielle and stand a little taller, because sometimes the smallest act of resolve becomes the spark that lights the way for others. If Danielle's story moved you, if you saw strength in her silence and courage in the way she chose justice over outrage, then let her know she's not standing alone. Leave a comment below. What would you say to Danielle if she were here today? What advice would you give her as she steps away from the spotlight and into the quiet work of legacy? Should she continue leading from behind the scene or step back into the fight if needed? Your voice matters. Because real change doesn't just come from policymakers, it comes from people like you who choose to care. And if you believe in a world where no one is judged by what they wear, where no child boards a plane in fear, and where dignity walks hand in hand with accountability, then share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Comment, like, share, and don't miss our next episode, where we take you deeper into the lives touched by Danielle's legacy and the unexpected ripple effects of one woman's resolve. Stay with us. The story isn't over.